Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana delivered his first medium-term budget policy statement yesterday. Frans, a somewhat tepid and uneventful address yesterday. What were some of your key takeaways?
Yeah, there's one big story, David, and that is the growth forecast, the rate of growth for the economy into the medium term, 1.7%. Now, emerging markets are expected to maintain levels in the region of around 5%. So South Africa's government's forecast, its expectation, is that we're going to do roughly a third of the rate of the group of economies that we are a part of. And in that, there are a few stories. The first is reform is not coming. If sweeping policy reforms were on the way, if the government was going to step back from expropriation, that number would be very much higher. Second thing that comes out of the growth number is political. The ANC suffered its first political defeat, a sub 50% result in an election recently. 3 years' time is the 2024, a national election. With a growth rate like this, there's little prospect for the ANC to address the socio-economic frustrations that sit at the heart of its declining political support. Third issue is stability of the country itself. Sweeping riots through Natal not very long ago. The number given by the minister means that the risk of that kind of violence flaring up in corners of the country remains a very real risk out over really as many years into the future as it's useful to look at.
And Frans, so in terms of reform, the minister made quite a big deal around spectrum allocation. This is kind of low-hanging fruit, not really that critical in the overall picture, but we are not seeing, I think, the substantive policy reforms that are needed, particularly with regards to energy. And this week we had rolling blackouts across the country, yet another week of load shedding. What do you think is the Treasury's view of the state-owned enterprises at the moment in terms of its ongoing funding obligations towards those public enterprises?
Yeah, David, on spectrum, for example, I mean, spectrum gets trotted out every time the South African government needs to make a policy speech. Our economy is not in the growth doldrums because we have too little spectrum. It's important to get spectrum right, undoubtedly, but if we do that, it doesn't take us up to emerging market growth rates. What needs to be done is to address the policy blockages around labor market policy, around empowerment policy, and security on property rights in order to unlock a real investor confidence and see the money come pouring into the country that's necessary to get that growth rate up to around 5%. On state-owned enterprise, the right noises were made. Yeah, does that feed through into real substantive action in cutting back on wasteful state-owned entities? My call for you is that's not going to happen. And the reason is the ANC, in deep political peril, as it is now, cannot afford to cut off the cadre deployment networks that are necessary to maintain its internal cohesion. On Eskom, I think the position is very bad. Andre de Ruyter is doing his level best, but his hands are tied in many respects. Our sense on Eskom has long been that even if de Ruyter can get parts of Eskom right, and there's going to be a lot of internal political opposition to that, I think that's playing out now. Vested interests, cadres, BE transactions, all of that stands in his way. Even if de Ruyter gets parts of Eskom right, Eskom on its own is no longer South Africa's energy solution. In fact, a little way back, we came up with the idea that if South Africa is to, by the end of this decade, reach emerging market growth averages, so that's that 5%, we'd need to generate outside of Eskom as much electricity as we're able to generate inside of Eskom. My outlook on Eskom, the little bit that one hears, is that if the South African economy tries to show signs of real life, a little bit of growth over the next 3 years, the risk is that we might run into permanent stage 4 or stage 6 even load shedding. And the only reason that won't happen is if demand in the economy for energy is low enough that the lights stay on more than the Eskom people have to turn them off.
So Enoch Godongwana comes from an organized labor background, Frans, and there's been a lot of noise from the likes of COSATU around a basic income grant and a much more expansionary budget. Do you think that he has the political capital to resist some of those calls? And do you think that he is perhaps even maybe sympathetic to some of those calls?
Yeah, I think there is some sympathy to those calls. I mean, he did in the speech quote the number of how many million South Africans, around half the population, that receive in one form or another the largesse of South Africa's welfare system. And South Africa runs probably, arguably, the largest welfare program of any emerging market. So topping that up a little bit more did deliver some benefit to households. Of course, there's a vast downside on investor perceptions of South Africa and the outlook for debt and the like. I think the instinct of the ANC will remain welfare, redistribution of wealth, as opposed to creating the circumstances to draw in the investment to make a job growth work. The minister did bemoan the fact that despite the size of next to the size of this welfare program, the number of people with jobs in South Africa has been declining. But there was no indication that from a policy perspective, his government is prepared to do anything to reverse that job decline trend.
Yeah, and as you say, the ANC potentially losing its majority in 2024, that's just going to build up that pressure for populist policies. Pork barrel politics, I think, will be the order of the day for the next 3 years or so.
Yeah. As long as the ANC survives, I think that's the expectation. I mean, they've had this huge election shock now a couple of days ago. This was the first opportunity to demonstrate that that shock has had the effect of being the straw that broke the camel's back, the last straw for the ANC. Now the floodgates of reform are going to be opened. The minister had the opportunity to put that message across. What we got instead was a little bit kind of tepid. There wasn't a great deal there. If you want a reform horizon for South Africa, though, look to 2024. It's now quite possible that a reform-minded block of parties, a new kind of front of them, could defeat the ANC outright. I was told in a meeting earlier today that that moment is 899 days away if it's going to happen. And it's perfectly possible that on day 900, you could begin to see the beginnings of a reform movement. If South Africa is going to do reform, it's going to come through the defeat of the ANC. It's not going to come through, I'm fairly certain, and I've been so for a long time, through the ANC getting a big enough shock to try and turn the South African economy around.